Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Let's turn to some news from the lower federal courts. This is rulings by two judges appointed by Barack Obama blocking President Biden's latest student loan forgiveness plan. This is called the SAVE plan. Alicia, one of the news stories I'm looking at says that people with undergraduate debt will no longer see their payments cut in half starting on July 1st. Which, as anyone with a calendar can see, is next Monday. So this must come as a surprise and a disappointment to a lot of people who had been making plans based on what President Biden promised.
What this SAVE plan did, if you recall, this was issued mere days. I think it was about a week after the Supreme Court last summer struck down, in some ways more sweeping, student loan forgiveness that forgave debt about $10,000 to $20,000 per borrower. This plan essentially just forgives and cancels debt on an installment plan. It revised the Obamacare's income-based repayment plans that capped monthly payments at 10% of discretionary income. And discretionary income then was defined as exceeding 150% of the poverty line. And again, all this was actually written in the Obamacare statute and forgave the remaining debt after 10 to 20 years. Now, what the Biden administration did last July was revise these plans, capping the monthly payments at 5% of discretionary income and forgiving the remaining balances again after 10 to 20 years, but also it increased what it was defined as discretionary income as 225% of the poverty level. Now, all this sounds very technical, but what it in fact did was further essentially cut in half, and in some ways, and for about 4 million borrowers, zeroed out the payments. And these 4 million borrowers are those who earn less than 225% of the poverty level. In fact, the White House actually had a blog post about how this was going to boost consumption by giving people more purchasing power since they no longer had to spend so much on their monthly payments, and that borrowers quote-unquote save and invest their monthly payments in the stock market and earn more than $100,000 over 20 years. It's basically as an arbitrage, which anyone who's paid down their loans would just find absolutely galling. Those are the kinds of incentives that it created. Now, what happened here is states sued and challenged this, saying that this was nowhere authorized by the legislation, unlike the Obama plans, which were actually specified in the law. Here, the Biden administration used a very vague provision in the Higher Education Act that allowed it to create alternative repayment plans on a case-by-case basis to help borrowers who needed exceptional circumstances. Here, basically, you create these repayment plans for all and anyone. And again, this is kind of how the administration has been acting in the past, saying that we're doing this on a case-by-case basis, but really providing with sweeping loan forgiveness. And what both judges here did is say, no, you didn't have the authority to do what you did, and block different provisions of these quote-unquote SAVE plans.
A couple of thoughts here. One is that we are only about a year out from a big Supreme Court ruling in a case called Biden v. Nebraska, saying that his administration did not have the authority to cancel about $430 billion of student loan balances without any action by Congress. And Kim, the president apparently did not take that as a rebuke because he is trying to do smaller cancellations. He's back in federal court. They're being blocked by Democratic appointed judges. And two, I've seen some political analysts of why President Biden is not doing better with younger voters in the polling on the November election, saying things like, well, Biden tried to forgive these student loans, and young voters shouldn't be mad at him about that. They should be mad at the Supreme Court that is standing in the way. But if you've been told by the President of the United States that your loans are going to be forgiven, or that the amount that you're going to have to pay is going to substantially drop here in a matter of weeks, and then the federal courts block that, I can understand how some of those voters would also be upset with President Biden that he's making promises that he doesn't have the constitutional authority to deliver.
Yeah, the thing that really struck me about these two decisions, in particular the one by Judge Daniel Crabtree, is that the Supreme Court's its major questions doctrine is beginning to reverberate through lower courts. And that was what Crabtree cited in issuing this injunction. Of course, that doctrine essentially holds that you cannot hide elephants in mouse holes, meaning that if Congress has not explicitly authorized you to take action on major questions, you do not, as an executive branch, get to take those major actions. That is very bad news, to your point, Kyle, for President Joe Biden, because what we have seen him doing is, rather than trying to work with Congress, rather than trying to extend the arm of bipartisanship to get some things done that might be acceptable to both sides, this is an administration that has very nakedly been attempting to use its executive authority to issue all of these rules or handouts that are designed for political benefit and for re-election this fall. And I think it really does risk coming back and biting him, because we're seeing example after example of this. The student loan debt, which is now we've seen getting tangled up in the courts, leaving all of those so-called young voters in limbo. The president recently came out with his new plan, I think it was just last week, to allow spouses of those who are American citizens to stay here under this huge new kind of extension of the former deferred action for childhood arrivals. That too is going to come before the courts. It could leave all of those immigrants to this country hanging as well in limbo about what their status will be. Do they dare come out of the dark and expose themselves to the government, knowing that this may not pass legal muster? We're getting a lot of this from the administration. It's clearly like a basis of his campaign re-election plan. But in some cases, as we see here, just patently against the law and the constraints of the executive branch. So it's a real loser, not just on the legal merits, but it's failing potentially as a political strategy as well, too.
Thank you, Kim and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.